Make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
I've spent a lot of my time not only teaching like the facts of American history and the things that we've talked about today on this podcast, but I'm deeply convinced that the major contribution that history makes to our democratic society, even to our churches, is in the way historians think about the world. We think about the world by putting ourselves and trying to understand, putting ourselves in the minds of people, maybe most of them are dead, but by the documents they left behind, trying to walk in the shoes of people who are different than us, understand the world on their terms rather than our terms. That's what we call historical empathy. And that's different than sympathy. I can empathize with someone who I might despise, but in order to be a good steward of that person's dignity, of the past, right, I need to at least try to understand what their view is before I critique it. I think that's a unique, sort of unnatural thing to do.
Hey, welcome back to Church and State 250, where we are looking at over 250 years of faith in America and the role that religion has played in shaping this country's history, politics, law, and public life. I'm your political host, Will Wright, and I'm joined as always by your faithful host, Josh Burtram. And today we have joining us John Fia. He's a distinguished professor of American history at Messiah University, historian of early America, American religion, and the founding, and is the author of several books to include the third edition of Was America Founded as a Christian Nation? For this series, John's going to help us slow down and look carefully at the founding, what the founders actually believed, what did the Constitution say about religion, and all those fun things that people have been talking about coming up with the anniversary of America. So welcome back to the show, John. It's good to have you.
Good to be back with you guys. Love the podcast.
Yeah. So we're just going to jump right into it and just start really kind of with the premise of your book. So your book was called Was America Founded as a Christian Nation? And I think that's probably a good place for us to start. So was America founded as a Christian nation?
Yeah, just let me say one thing kind of in advance before I get into that. I am recently retired from Messiah. I want to give proper shout out to the place where I work now. I'm now working at a Center for Christianity and Culture called the Lumen Center at the University of Wisconsin, on the campus of University of Wisconsin-Madison. We're not connected to UW-Madison, but I'm out here in Madison now. The third edition of the book is actually a more concise edition of the first two versions, and it has a different title actually this time. It's called In God We Trust, and then the subtitle is Was America Founded as a Christian Nation? So there's actually 3 new chapters. You know, my publisher makes me do this. You know, she says every time you go on a podcast, you gotta explain this to people. But what do people mean when they say America was founded as a Christian nation? Well, one of the things I think that's important to realize is usually when people are talking about this question today, it's a conversation much more about the present than it is the past. The idea of was America founded as a Christian nation, or the idea of a Christian founding, was really something that became a hot political topic after 1976, after the bicentennial of the United States, and has really been going strong for the last 50 years. What I'm about to say, I'm saying this as a historian, but Americans from, say, the ratification of the Constitution in 1789 through, say, the 1960s and 70s, most Americans believed that they were living in a Christian nation. That doesn't necessarily mean that they were interpreting the founding correctly by saying that. That doesn't mean they were right in thinking that. But generally, people believed that they were living in a Christian nation. I was recently, about 5 years ago, I was on a panel in Rhode Island, which was an early advocate of religious liberty. And I was on a panel about Roger Williams, one of the founders of Providence, Rhode Island. This was in Newport at the Quaker Meeting House in Newport. And I was on a panel with a Jewish historian who was a member of Toro Synagogue, which is the oldest still functioning synagogue in the world, in the country. This is the synagogue that George Washington wrote a letter to protecting the religious freedom of Jews. And I made this claim that up until the 70s, most people believed they were living in a Christian nation. I was a little antsy. I wasn't sure what this Jewish scholar was going to say. And then afterwards he says, great point about the Christian nation. If anyone knows that we've been living in a Christian nation for the last sentence,
it's Jewish people.
It's Jews. So I was like, whew, yeah, I wasn't sure.
You're like, thanks, someone finally said it.
Yeah. But my point here is this, that today, when people fight over whether or not we're founded as a Christian nation, they don't seem to be interested in the complete fullness and complexity of the relationship between religion and the founding in the 18th century. What they're really interested in is using the past in some way, cherry picking what they need from the past in order to promote whatever their present day agenda is. And this is done by the left and the right. I do think the right is more notorious in this area, the Christian right. But so when you hear people arguing over this, it's really an argument about sort of present day politics or present day American identity, that it isn't necessarily about anything to do with the 18th century.
Yeah, it's like this is a historical question, right? When we're asking, was America founded as a Christian nation? Because it's different than the question, is America a Christian nation today versus...
I would answer that question perhaps a little differently about, is America a Christian nation, than I would, was America founded as a Christian nation?
Oh, absolutely. Right. They're two different questions, really. Yeah. And then what do we want America to be? Do we want America to be a Christian nation, or to be even more explicitly Christian than it is now? Right. And there's separate questions that get all like tangled in and mixed together. And so you're trying to suss them out. And then when people are you're trying to answer the question, you're like, oh, wait, let me first divide that into 3 questions. People start snoring and getting bored. And well, can't you just get to the point? Well, no, I can't, because the past is complicated. I mean, I would love for you to go into this, because I think this will probably connect to me what you're thinking. Like, what is true about this claim? Let's get even a little bit more granular. What's true about the claim that this nation was started as a Christian nation? And then what is wrong about it? What do people get wrong about it? I mean, no, you're saying they're cherry picking, but can we get more specific? Can we get more granular on it? What is true about that claim? When we say it's a Christian nation, what data is like, yes, this fits in that well? And then what data militates against it? Go ahead, sir.
So if you wanted to make an argument that America was founded as a Christian nation, right, you would turn to several things. You would turn to the founding fathers' views, for many of them at least, that religion was absolutely essential to sustaining a republic. This would be George Washington, for example, in his farewell address, where he described religion and morals as a necessary support for a republic. I always find this to be very interesting because, these founders, and we may have talked about this in a previous episode I was on with you, but these founders were primarily statesmen. They were building a republic. That was their penultimate goal. That was their most important goal. They wanted to create a republican form of government following independence from Great Britain. Now, if religion and morals could serve that goal, that primary goal, the founding fathers were all for it. If there was a form of religion, and there was, Quakerism, for example, Mennonites, Brethren, and we call them Anabaptists, who were deeply religious, certainly their religious liberty would have been protected, but had a role of critiquing the republic, calling it out for its sins, standing apart from the government like the church should do, I believe. And
how dare they?
And challenging the government. I'm not sure the founders would have much use for that kind of religion to achieve their primary goal, building a republic. But certainly it is the case that they believed that religion, even Christianity, was a way to create virtuous citizens. And what I mean by virtuous citizens, I mean people who were willing to, at times, sacrifice their own selfishness, their own self-interest, their own rights for the greater good of the republic and its survival. So that would be one place I would turn to make that argument. But even then, as I just did, it's a little more nuanced. I think a lot of people might turn to, and I think this is the strongest argument for America being founded in a way that sort of privileged Christianity. You could turn to many of this, not all, but many of the state constitutions that were formed after 1776. Let's just take the state I lived in for the last 24 years, Pennsylvania. In the state of Pennsylvania, in their constitution of 1776, which was largely written by devout Presbyterians who took over the state assembly, you have, in order to hold office, you have to believe in the divine inspiration of the Old Testament and the New Testament. And if you do not, you cannot hold office. It's clear that the state of Pennsylvania, in its current manifestation, in which these Presbyterians were controlling the General Assembly, the legislative body of the state in Philadelphia, that they wanted only Christians. Now, there's great stories there about the 1790 Constitution, 14 years later, great stories about the Jewish community in Philadelphia fighting for their religious liberty. Of course, they always had the religious liberty there to worship freely. The government wasn't interfering with the Jewish community in Philadelphia, but they also fought for removing that divine inspiration of the New Testament. And by 1790, they were successful in getting the 1790 Constitution to take that out. But there are other states as well, like New England states, Connecticut and Massachusetts. They have religious established churches. That means taxpayer money going to support a church that you may not be part of that church, but you still have to pay the taxes. They had state churches, the Congregational Church, Connecticut until 1819, New England until 1833. So this then leads to this larger question, right, of what is a nation? Between 1776 and the Constitution in 1787 and then ratified in 1789, there is no real unified nation. There's no federal government. There's a loose kind of Congress. All the power under the Articles of Confederation rested in the states, and they could decide on their own. So you had Virginia, where there was no established church, no testos, no privileging any religion. You had Massachusetts privileging the congregational religion. You had Pennsylvania saying you got to uphold the divine inspiration of the New Testament and the Old Testaments, right? So if you want to say we became a nation immediately after 1776, that's when we were founded, right? You could make a decent argument that many of these states, not all, but many, this is, again, more of the complication, wanted Christians to be in office and privileged Christians running their states. Again, the other side of this debate is the Constitution itself. Well, first first you have Virginia, right? The state of Virginia, which was in many ways a model for the First Amendment. They never had Virginia Statute of Religious Liberty. They did not have a test oath. They did not have an established church. But the First Amendment, right? No test oath in Article 6 for federal government in the Constitution. The First Amendment disestablishes religion. Free exercise of religion in the first, and nothing about God. Now, technically, God is mentioned in the Constitution. In the last line, it says, "In the year of our Lord."
Oh, there you go, dude. Yeah, I guess it's true.
You laugh at that, but I've been in rooms where I'll make the claim that the Constitution is godless, and someone will bring that up. So I actually had to. I actually had to research that. Of course, it's the standard way of doing the date back then, right? But it was also, I researched this and also realized that actually the word Lord was not written. The year of our Lord would have been written by a scribe long after the members of the Constitutional Convention had left the building and had gone home. So it wasn't like they were debating this, like, should we put the Lord in there or not? It was just, the scribe, of course.
They were putting a date on.
The scribe was paid to do. Of course he wrote in the year of our Lord. That's how everybody wrote. So, but you're right. There's nothing in there. You could make that argument. You could make the argument, again, especially on First Amendment grounds, that there should be no religion privileged by the state. Taxpayer money should not be going to support religious agendas, religious programs. So the whole argument that you hear today about, well, the separation of church and state was meant to, it was the church wasn't going to interfere with the state, but the same wasn't true the other way. That's really complicated, much more complicated than the debate we have today. So, in 1947, when Hugo Black, the Supreme Court justice, said that there was a wall of separation between church and state, and that wall is high and impregnable. I mean, I don't know where he was getting his history from, because religion always passed through we have military chaplains that are paid by the government. There's a chaplain who prays before meetings of Congress. Thomas Jefferson actually worshiped in the Congress at a church service, right? Almost shortly thereafter, he wrote that famous Danbury letter where he says there's a wall of separation. So in one sense, there's always been these checkpoints, as one historian called it, between the wall. But that doesn't mean the wall doesn't exist. So the idea of if the federal government is going to promote a particular brand of religion over another brand of religion, and taxpayer money is paying for those things, that is a violation of the Establishment Clause. And that's exactly what the colonists were trying to get away from. And that's why they did not want established churches, because, Jefferson says this very clearly in the Virginia Statute on Religious Liberty. He says, we cannot coerce someone with their tax money, he literally says, their tax dollars, to support a religion that they do not believe in, right? So, So, that's a very big argument against the idea that America should privilege one nation or one religion over another.
John, the way that you have kind of described that part of history seems in conflict with the way that I think I've often seen it portrayed. And I'll give you a real solid, concrete example. Recently, the administration released a quote unquote documentary called By Dawn's Early Light, which is based off of a 565-page anti-Christian bias task force report that was recently put out. The documentary has a lot of AI, but a lot of the AI is showing sort of this America that was praying all the time, people kneeling, the Constitutional Convention. And it was just a lot of imagery that showed, a connection to Christianity much closer than the connection that at least you're describing. So help us kind of just think through that. When we think about the Constitutional Convention and the role that faith played, how does all that kind of wash out?
Yeah, a lot, not all, but a lot of those stories that you hear, I haven't seen this documentary, but a lot, I know the discourse well enough. A lot of the things that say people like David Barton from Wall Builders, who's a big Christian nationalist kind of historian, or Eric Metaxas, who hasn't
scare quotes for those who are listening.
Yeah, who's pitching this new book on the American Revolution.
He was in the documentary, by the way. Eric
a lot of the facts are correct. Last month at Rededicate 250, this big event on the Washington Mall to celebrate the 250th anniversary of George Washington. I'm sorry, the Continental Congress's call for a day of thanksgiving, humiliation, and prayer. It was on May 17th. 1776, May 17th, 2026, 250 years later. That happened, right? The First Continental Congress opened with prayer from Christ Church minister Jacob Duché. He prayed for the United States. I was actually there on the 250th anniversary. I gave a talk. I got to actually give a talk, or actually had dinner inside Carpenter's Hall after I gave a talk. It happened. I was there to talk about it and contextualize it 250 years later. So all of these things that sort of some, conservatives or Christian right people appeal to did happen. Religion is important. And I think as we think about the 250th anniversary, I think it's important to acknowledge these things, right? Here, though, I think is where you have to be very, very careful. And this is where historical interpretation comes in, right? And this is where the fight really takes place in the culture wars. Number one, there is this question I would call of proportionality. In other words, these things certainly happened, but to what extent did the prayer at the First Continental Congress or Ben Franklin's call for prayer during the Constitutional Convention or these days of Thanksgiving and fasting, there were multiple, right, that took place. To what extent were they the defining events of what today we call the American Revolution or the Revolutionary Era? Anyone who teaches that period in a college history class, and I'm not just talking about like secular universities. I'm talking about where I taught for 25 years, Messiah University. I'm even talking about professors I know at places like Liberty University or Bob Jones University will teach that period by going through from 1763 to 1776. They will talk about the Stamp Act, which was a protest against taxation. They will talk about the Townsend duties, which was a protest against certain enumerated articles that were being imported into the colonies. They will talk about the Boston Tea Party. They will talk about the coercive acts. They will talk about political tyranny. They will talk about taxation. They will talk about the resistance to all of these things. That is the central narrative of the American Revolution. It was about political tyranny, taxes, economic tyranny, and what's certainly true is that there were Christians who were living in this time who were possibly interpreting all of those things through the lens of their biblical faith. But they weren't the central narrative, right? So you could be like, like any Christian watching the news today and saying like, oh, I really don't like this. I wish God was more, involved, or I'm going to pray for our country. They're not praying like the Christians were not like saying, oh, I'm praying that we'll establish a Christian nation. They were praying that the injustice of the taxation and the political tyranny would go away. So to put the Christian story or the development of some type of Christian nation or some kind of providential nation at the center of the narrative, I think, is the problem that I see in a lot of people like Eric Metaxas, David Barton, and others. So that's the first problem. And I'll be real quick on the second problem. The second problem also has to do then, and it's related to the first, is about how to think about the relationship between the past and the present. And I may have said this to you guys when I was on before, right? There are many who want to take the 18th century, the founding, especially as it relates to what the founders said about religion, and freeze it, and then somehow transport it to 2026 and just kind of unthaw it and say, here we go. We were a Christian nation then, we're now. As if nothing has changed in the United States from 1789 to the present. We've not become a more diverse population. We've not become a more diverse religiously plural population. So, instead of going to the founders to try to say, like, we need to reproduce the Christian nation that they founded, maybe we should look at the founders and say, well, what did they think about the potential, or did they talk about the potential of what the republic might look like in religion moving forward? Did they have a vision of religious liberty that might apply to non-Christians or others who might come into the infidels, they called them, atheists, right? Did they think about them? And rather than just kind of freezing them in this moment, 1776, and then bringing them to the present. So that's a big challenge. I think a lot of people like Eric Metaxas, David Barton, other so-called Christian nationalists who use the past to promote their political agendas are, in essence, just freezing, they're originalists, right? Much like the originalist interpretation of the, say, Constitution.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Women were vital to the history of American Christianity. But now growing numbers of women are quitting the church over misogyny, abuse, racism, homophobia, and the big banner that seems to connect it all, Christian nationalism. I'm Sarah Stancorp, and my new book, Damned If She Does, is about why millions of American women have quit church and what it means for the future. Keep listening at the end of this episode for an exclusive Faithful Politics sneak peek.
Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. And I was thinking as you were talking, John, we celebrated the calling of the First Continental Congress or the Continental Congress, right, to humiliation and prayer and all that. But interestingly, I don't hear a lot of celebrations about Richard Henry Lee's June resolution that actually got the Declaration of Independence, even like as an idea that was in people's minds. No one talks about that. No one knows about things that even Jefferson seemed to exaggerate within the Declaration of Independence. We treat it like it's an inspired document straight from heaven. Now, I think it's an inspired document in many of its philosophical principles and its ideals, but I don't think we should get it twisted. And there's something in our minds that we have to sacralize these people and almost mythologize them, right? Make them heroes, make them bigger than they act, demigods. Yes, bigger than they actually are. You look at Thomas Jefferson, and man, we could look at Thomas Jefferson and have a lot of thankfulness and also have a lot of questions about his morality, about his views of world, religion, all that kind of stuff. He is not necessarily the guy I'd want my daughter to bring home, so it's
You're not going to give him membership in your church, Josh? He's not going to pass the doctrine.
I'm not going to ask him to teach on the Gospels. And so here's the thing, right? It's like we mythologize these people and then we're building all these arguments on them. And so then we have to double down. Yeah. Because if you call into question Thomas Jefferson's, his holiness or his piety, then this house of cards or the Jenga that they're building begins to loosen, right? It gets unstable. And so I really would love for us to, even when we're thinking about the founders, demythologize the founders in terms of their religion, right? I think one of the things that I hear, we've even had people on our podcast, and we struggle with this because we want everyone to say what they think. We want to give everyone a chance. That's what our, podcast is about. We want people to be able to speak their minds where we're not just sitting here trying to get gotchas and catch them and all this stuff. Yeah. And yet we've had people literally say things that we found to be factually inaccurate about the founders, about their, the seminary degrees that the founders had, quote unquote, whatever it is, right? And I think that people hear this.
Had seminary degrees. I've heard that one a lot.
Yes, that's actually what was said. Yeah. So can we demythologize this for people just factually?
Yeah.
So at least we're starting on the right place.
First let me make a comment about kind of sort of a more general comment.
Yes, please.
We need history more than ever. And
yes,
I'm a Christian, and I'm a historian, professionally trained historian, taught it for 25 years, written 6 books on American history, mostly American history. And I'm also a Christian. I identify as an evangelical Christian, right?
Same.
I was just with a group of Catholic school history teachers at Notre Dame. I was doing a workshop with them earlier this week. And one of the things we're talking about is one of the things I said to them is, which I've said to my students for years, there are no heroes in history. Any historian knows this. There are no heroes in history. There are no villains in history. And then everybody says, "Oh my God, what? What do you mean?" Right? And it, I'm kind of messing with their minds a little bit by saying this, but all of the heroes that we build up to heroes, if you have a robust view of sin, I'll name that, right? As a Christian, if you have a strong view of sin, you should expect, King David, right, immediately comes to mind, but you should expect, you should never hold up someone as a hero, because there's probably a good chance, because of their fallen nature, that they're going to disappoint you at some point, right? On the other hand, there are no villains. Of course, there are people who do what might be called villainous acts, right? But if you believe in the human dignity of all people, and that all people are worthy of redemption, right? That God has provided redemption.
It's good, John.
You're not going to, you can't completely identify. The Bible says to love your enemies, right? So,
that's right.
So of course we want to call out, as historians,
right,
the so-called villainous acts. Of course we want to lift up, to me at least as a Christian, glimpses of when sort of the kingdom of God breaks through, and we see hope, right, and we see positive things, and we see loving actions, and all these kinds of things, right? Of course that's what we do. But I think that's when I started the answer to this question. I said we need more good history, because any historian who spent enough time in the past knows that our heroes are going to fall or might disappoint us at some point. And I think that idea really should be applied to the founders, And I talk about the theology of it here simply because I want people who might be listening to what I just said, where I'm kind of suggesting that the founders are flawed human beings and not demigods, to know that I'm coming at this question not as some like secular person, but as a Christian myself.
Yes.
Because of my theology, that I don't expect them to be perfect, right? So in terms of the religious beliefs of the founders, I've said this for a long time. I think there's a danger sometimes in connecting the religious beliefs of the founders to how they perceive the role of religion and society, or religion and government. And, so you have everything from, with the founders' own personal religious beliefs, you have everything from Thomas Jefferson, who is, a skeptic, does not believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, does not believe Jesus is God, hopefully some of your listeners know about his Jefferson Bible, which he cut out all the supernatural and so forth, right? And then you have, even an Orthodox, on the other side, you have an Orthodox clergyman, the president of the College of New Jersey at Princeton, John Witherspoon, who, actually, Josh, might be comfortable in your church.
Yes, definitely.
So it's a wide range. I always the hair comes up on the back of my neck whenever I hear people say, well, the founders believe this, like on religion. I'm like, which one? The founders were deists. Or the founders were Christians, right? Let's get into the weeds a little bit, So again, I know we don't have the time to go through every founder and what they believe. John Adams who evangelicals love, would never be willing to sign a doctrinal statement in an evangelical church or whatever. He was a Unitarian. He didn't even believe in the Trinity, right? So
nice.
But But yet, and this is where I said the founding fathers' religious beliefs may not be the best barometer, right? John Adams also believed that he wrote the 1780 Massachusetts Constitution, which put the Congregational Church as the established church. Because he, even though he disagreed with the Trinity, which the Congregational Church taught, he thought it was really good to have money go to support a church to create a more moral society, right? Or you have John Witherspoon, who would have argued that, he loved the Presbyterians. I think if he had his way, he would have wanted it to be a Presbyterian country, right? But was willing to sacrifice that idea in order to have religious freedom. And it was able to sign on to, documents related to religious freedom for all groups, right? So a lot of, we need to be careful. It's a good intellectual exercise. It's interesting to talk about like what the founders believed, but oftentimes that does not always translate to what they would have thought about church and state.
Yeah, and would it be accurate, John, to say that the primary way that the founders viewed, even though they had varieties of ways of belief, spectrum of belief and faith, the primary way that they viewed religion when it came to government was instrumental, in the sense that it would create the kind of populace that could be governed? Is that accurate?
I think I probably wouldn't quite put it that way, because there is, I would suggest that the founders did respect people's actual religious beliefs. They wanted people to be able to worship freely. The way you suggested it, Josh, I'm not picking on you here, but they didn't want to kind of, like a Marxist idea of like religion is the opiate of the masses.
Gotcha.
It's the way we control them, right?
Gotcha. Okay.
But it's something in between. Right.
That makes sense.
And this gets back to what I said earlier in the podcast, right? They wanted a religion. They believed that religion was useful. Let 1,000 religious beliefs bloom. We don't want to get involved. You can, even the little sect known as the Swedenborgians, this like today, some people might call it a cult. Washington writes a letter to them. You can worship freely. We're not going to interfere. Do whatever you want in terms of your religious beliefs. So as long as, of course, it's in the bounds of the law. But, we just believe that if religion teaches good morals, the founders believed, and they knew this from studying the ancient Greeks and Romans, right? In order for a republic to survive, you have to have a citizenry that is thinking of the common good, the public good, not always just their rights. Rights are important. The American Revolution is about rights and defending rights. John Locke, right? And this liberal tradition of rights. But they also were always thinking about rights in the context of a community, a national community, a republic that they were hoping to build. And if those rights got in the way of this kind of virtue that they needed, this self-sacrificial virtue, that was a problem. If everyone, to quote the book of Judges, did that which was right in their own eyes, the republic would erode based upon individualism and selfishness. So religion, they believed, was a way in which maybe that kind of selflessness, they wouldn't have put it in religious terms like love of neighbor or caring for your community, right? But that might strengthen the republic. Yes, it was instrumental in that way.
When you said earlier that, so the Constitution has provisions, no establishment of a religion, no religious test. And you also said that the colonies, though, in their own little constitutions did have those types of religious tests. So like, how did the colonies like receive, word that the federal government isn't going to, require this, or was it like a non-issue because the 14th Amendment, didn't make it required?
Well, this is an issue of what, political philosophers, legal scholars call federalism, small f federalism. Right. And that is the idea that, whatever is not specifically forbidden or endorsed by the United States Constitution, it's up to the states to navigate and support. So the 10th Amendment, for instance, basically says what I just said. If the federal government, is not specific on something, the states can do it. So this was a way to justify doing what the states could do whatever they want with church and government. They could have testos. They could have religious established. By the way, it was also a way that was often used by some to justify, later on the institution of slavery, right? We can do whatever we want. But of course, in many ways, the Confederacy and the slaveholding South prior to the Civil War actually had the Constitution on their side to begin with the three-fifths compromise. But that's a whole other story. So they were allowed to do what they wanted with religion. And that's why you see such diversity, right? Like we talked about before, you see Virginia doing one thing, Rhode Island doing something similar, Massachusetts doing something with an establishment, Maryland, interesting. I think Maryland, I have to go back and look at this, but I think Maryland's Constitution of 1776 actually refers to Maryland as a quote unquote Protestant state, which is really ironic because it was actually founded by Catholics fleeing persecution in the 1630s. But by a generation, the Catholics no longer have control over that colony. It's largely a Protestant colony. So there's that, I think, dimension of this that you need to consider. This is why New England could have an establishment, Massachusetts could have an establishment until 1833. And that establishment was not removed based on any kind of legal reason. I mean,
it wasn't unconstitutional, right?
No,
there wasn't a judgment.
They just decided to get rid of it because the colony was becoming much more diverse, or the state, rather.
The state, right? Yeah, that point.
In their religious beliefs, and there are people pushing against it. So there's that dimension of this conversation about the relationship between the state. Now, what's really interesting as well is in the debates over the United States Constitution, these would be the debates. So you have 1780, get your listeners oriented chronologically here. You have 1787, which is when they met in Philadelphia to basically write what became known as the United States Constitution. Then you had in 1788, you had the ratification controversy. This is where you had the Federalists, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay, writing the Federalist Papers to defend the Constitution, because ultimately under the Articles of Confederation, which was the existing government, you couldn't do anything unless you had 9 of 13 states to approve what you did. So imagine these guys coming out of Philadelphia, in 1787, it's a hot, long summer, and they're like, we got this new document, the Constitution, we made it, we created it, right? And that it means nothing at that point until 9 of 13. Now they have to convince 9 of 13 states to essentially give up all this power that they once had under the Articles of Confederation to a strong central government. I mean, that's a, in some ways, the Constitution is like the greatest political coup in Western history, that they were managed to pull this thing off. I mean, it barely passes in like some of the bigger states, because they don't want to, today you tell it to students and they say, what, who wouldn't be against the Constitution, right? But it was the Federalist, but the critics of the Constitution, the ones who voted against it, were known as anti-Federalists. And it wasn't the central argument. This gets back to this question about proportionality we were talking about. But one of the arguments that they made was that the Constitution did not declare America to be a nation under God, or mention it was a religious nation, and so forth, and that they wanted that put in to the United States Constitution. That was one of their arguments, because if you don't have a test oath, some of them would say you might have like Jews or infidels, right, or Hindus, or all kinds of weird, quote unquote, weird religious people holding office, and we can't have that. So this is why we oppose the Constitution, because of Article 6, the test oaths, right? So it's interesting. It's the Christians who really want the Christian nation, who are the ones who oppose the Constitution, right? Because the Constitution says nothing about any of that, and they think this is too secular. The Constitution. Well, they lose. And the Constitution remains a generally secular document. The test oath stays in there, and then the amendments are passed a couple of years later. The First Amendment, which has the disestablishment and religious freedom clauses.
So I want to stay on that topic of the First Amendment, but get to the sense, obviously the context of the First Amendment is super important. How did it get brought about? How did people understand it at the time? What were the causes of this? And maybe you can hit those as you hit this question, because this is really, I think, the most important one. When they were imagining religious liberty, right, today we hear that and we think a certain thing about it. Anyone can believe anything in the United States of America. What did they mean by religious liberty? Did they understand it in the same way we did? I guess, let me put it this way, because obviously I think because it's 250 years in the past, they didn't understand it in the same way we did. They wouldn't have thought about it in the same terms. So what's the difference? Maybe we can contrast them. And what endures in there? What principle endures, do you think, that we still have today?
Yeah, we've mentioned this now several times already, but the First Amendment says every American has the right to worship freely, the free exercise of religion, right, thereof. And then there is no privileged or established church, right? That's the First Amendment. That's it. Right? It doesn't say like whether or not you can pray at the 50-yard line at the football game.
No, nothing else.
It doesn't say whether you can put a 10 Commandments up in front of City Hall, right? I mean, so clearly the founders created a court system, ultimately the Supreme Court, to be able to interpret the United States Constitution and what these clauses mean in the context of historical development when things come up, like can you pray at a 50-yard line, or can government money be used to bus Catholic kids to school, right? All these kinds of huge religious liberty questions, right? So if we're going to go just on the First Amendment, it's really, really hard to figure out like what the founders believed about. Now, having said that, there are, depending on which founder you read, and Jefferson and Madison, especially Jefferson, are the clearest on this. We do know that the founding fathers certainly had in mind, we're looking forward, right? We're looking into the future to imagine how these ideas of religious liberty that they championed might apply if the country became more diverse. The best example here is Thomas Jefferson's Virginia Statute on Religious Liberty, 1786, I want to say, which is before the Constitution. There's some debate among historians as to how much that informed the First Amendment or not. We won't get into the weeds on that here. But clearly Jefferson, and he wrote this later in life when he was talking about the Virginia Statute, essentially says that what we wrote in the Virginia Statute in 1786, I think it's like in the 1820s, towards the end of his life, he's looking back and interpreting what he thinks the Virginia Statute means. He says clearly these religious liberty issues apply to everyone. And he names religious groups: Jews, Mohammedans, right? Muslims, Hindus, always spelled with two O's, right? In the 18th century, Hindus, right? And infidels, those who don't believe, right? So Madison does something similar, but some of these founders are certainly thinking about how their ideas in the 18th century are going or should be applied to non-Christian groups going forward. And, we can have a debate about how much those ideas are representative of all of the founders. Most of the founders just didn't address these kinds of future issues. But we have enough, I think, in Jefferson and in some cases Madison to make an argument that the founding fathers clearly believed that this was a country, not a Christian country, where Christianity would be privileged over other religions, but that all religions would be able to come and worship here freely. Religious freedom is different than religious toleration. And again, I may have said, I can't remember what I said to you last time I was here, right? But religious toleration is essentially, to put it crudely, is we're the privileged religion. We don't really like you. We disagree with you, but we will tolerate you and let you worship freely, right? Like we'll let you be here. Religious freedom, which goes back to even the 17th century, William Penn, who founded Pennsylvania, but also I think the founders' view that's embodied in the First Amendment suggests there is no privileged religion, right? There is no established church. but rather we are a religiously plural nation in which everyone can come here and worship, within the bounds of the law, right? Immigration laws, again, we can have a whole debate about that, but within the bounds of the law, right? You can come here and worship or not worship, right? If you want. And we're not, government's not going to interfere, and we are not going to privilege one religion over another.
John, you're
so good.
Yeah, your work has been really, really impactful, just to my understanding of history and religion. And, it's also, one of the many bases for which the church and state separation, or Church and State 250 series is a thing, because the more I read about the nuance and sort of the relationship of religion in America, just the more I think people would benefit from understanding it. But you've been teaching history for, over 2 decades. This is sort of like your time to shine because it's 250, right? So
the phone's ringing a lot these days.
Everybody's looking for a historian.
I bet it is.
What better historian than John Fia? So I'd love to just get your thoughts. This is my last question: is like, what does this moment mean to you? I mean, a person that knows his history better than anybody I know, it has to probably bring up something. So I'd love to just get your thoughts on that.
I'm looking at the 250. I love my country, but I also want to be a faithful citizen of my country, which means that just as a citizen and as a Christian, I want to weigh it against the teachings of the church, the kingdom of God, whatever you want to call it. So I'm a patriot in the sense that I want to praise my country for the good things that it's done, and it's done many good things. I'm not one of these America haters, right? You should see me during the Olympics. I'm like, yeah. On the other hand, I think as a historian and even as a Christian who is a member of what I believe to be an alternative kind of kingdom, I have a political responsibility as well to speak out when the history is bad, when we're using history irresponsibly to advance political causes, but also as a Christian to speak out prophetically. And if you're caught up in the whole government, right, and you're sort of flattering the king, so to speak, if government becomes Christianity in some ways, Christianity takes over government, what role does the church have in a kind of being a prophetic voice? So there's that dimension of what I'm thinking about. The next way I'll answer that question is just as a historian. I've spent a lot of my time not only teaching like the facts of American history and the things that we've talked about today on this podcast, but I'm deeply convinced that the major contribution that history makes to our democratic society, even to our churches, is in the way historians think about the world. We think about the world by putting ourselves and trying to understand, putting ourselves in the minds of people, maybe most of them are dead, but by the documents they left behind, trying to walk in the shoes of people who are different than us, understand the world on their terms rather than our terms. That's what we call historical empathy. And that's different than sympathy. I can empathize with someone who I might despise, but in order to be a good steward of that person's dignity, of the past, right, I need to at least try to understand what their view is before I critique it. I think that's a unique, sort of unnatural thing to do. But it's something that there's a great book by a historian named Sam Weinberg called Historical Thinking and Other Unnatural Acts, right? Because we want to go into the past looking for something to promote the present. Everybody does it. And sometimes when that idea gets on steroids, it goes in all kinds of crazy directions because we start to ignore the proportionality and we cherry pick and so forth. I would hope in the 250th, not only do we use the history of the founding responsible, but I've been on this kind of crusade to push for the absolute importance of historical thinking, to think in terms of empathy, to think in terms of the human dignity of our subjects. What does it mean maybe even to love a person? Like Jesus says to love our enemies, right? What does that mean when I'm teaching like the pro-slavery argument in the 19th century, right? I don't sympathize with it, but historical empathy helps me to understand why these men believe what they believe. I want my students to do it, even if it's just to prepare them for a debate, right? You need to know the best argument that your opponent has, right? So you need to, so I think history is the one discipline that challenges you to do this rather than to critique or to provide moral condemnation on all those people who burned witches or whatever. That's not an excuse for dismissing immoral behavior in the past, but it's a way of thinking, a habit of mind, if you will, that we need more of in our democratic society. I think someone who studies history deeply and learns how to think historically. And I don't even mean just in terms of empathy, but in terms of thinking contextually, right? Thinking in terms of change over time, like we've talked about today. Thinking in terms of the complexity of the human experience as it unfolds through time, right? All of these things are what historians do. I'm convinced that if people learned how to do this better, our democracy, our churches would be richer, more intellectually responsible. And so that's what I also hope. We're in this moment where everybody's talking about history. And yeah, there's the facts. You can bring on, probably you've already had like fact checkers come on this show who this person was wrong or that person's wrong. And that's obviously important. Don't get me wrong. I've done plenty of it myself. But I think the real issue here is, what does this approach to the past that I'm trying to suggest, this responsible approach to the past, how might that make us better people, better Christians, better democratic citizens? So there's my soapbox. Yeah.
I love your soapbox.
I love it.
And this is great. Thank you so much, John. This has been a really, really good conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Good luck with the series, guys. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you. And to our listeners, and make sure you stick around and watch the rest of our Church and State 250 series, where we look at over 250 years of faith in America. And as always, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. We'll see you next time. Take care. Bye. Hey, welcome back to Faithful Politics, and for our brief little interview with the one and only Sarah Stancorp. How's it going, Sarah?
Good. It's going well. Thanks for doing this.
Oh, so at this year's Southern Baptist Convention, and I'm no expert, but I can read the news, they voted overwhelmingly to advance some sort of formal ban on churches with women pastors. And your book, Damned If She Does, looks at why women are leaving the church and what that means for the future of religion. So I'd love for you just to, maybe give us what's one story that helps explain how a decision like what happened at the SBC shouldn't really surprise anybody.
So when I had the idea to write this book probably over a decade ago, I thought it would be very contemporary and how now we're decades hence. And when I sat down to write the book, I realized I actually needed to start in the 1980s because a lot of the threads that became important in women's lives started then. And I know this mini interview may become part of a broader conversation on Christian nationalism. As I look at the way evangelicalism, how the Christian right has embedded itself with our politics and really turned into a Christian nationalist machine, a big piece of that is Christian patriarchy. The way women are oppressed within this system is kind of a model for oppression of all of us. So jumping back to the beginning of the book, I started with Danuta Soderman, who was a co-host of the 700 Club with Pat Robertson, and she was granted a bit of influence there. She could talk to the country. She could even preach sometimes. God forbid. But she also was bounded by certain rules. She could have this influence if she followed certain rules. And as soon as she didn't, as soon as she was a threat that Robertson needed to dispose of, she was gone. When I think about the SBC, and I think about just year after year, amendments like this come up, attempting to silence women after women have worked so hard to press SBC for reform on sex abuse. This is no coincidence. When I look at that trajectory, and there are still women in SBC, many are leaving, a lot of people have left SBC. I see women who are making some sort of compromise. And they're there, whether it's for comfort or community or because they're too scared to leave and they know what they'll lose if they leave. They're making a deal, but they're eventually gonna lose. And I think that's the heartbreaking part of seeing what's happening now within that denomination is bad for the church. It certainly isn't good evangelism. But it's also so bad for women who, the longer they stay and tolerate being treated like this, it breaks them down. And eventually the only way to safety is to leave.
Wow. Well, your book, The End She Does, when does it come out and where can people buy it?
September 15th and everywhere. Everywhere we can get a book, you can buy a book there. It's going to be a big publication day. A bunch of other big books are coming out then. So I'm hopeful September is going to be a good month for dialogue about faith in America, especially in our current political situation.
Yeah. And your website?
sarahstancorp.com.
That's easy. And I will make sure all of this is in the show notes. And thanks again, Sarah, for stopping by and telling us about your book.
Thank you.
Awesome.